Thank you, Michael and Florian, for having me, to the Canadian Visa Department, to Ottawa. Pour les francophones, je suis désolée, mon français n'est pas génial, donc je vais parler en anglais. We know what a zero-sum game is, if we've ever played poker. A zero-sum game is where one party's losses precisely equals the other party's gains. That's what happens in poker. One person walks away with what everybody else lost. There's no new chips created. In non-zero-sum games, parties' wins and losses don't exactly cancel each other out. So copyright is non-zero-sum. A change in the scope of rights can make one party end up with much more than any other party loses. But very often we see copyright debates as being framed as being about creators versus users. And that framing misdirects us. It suggests that copyright is zero-sum. It ignores that symbiosis between creation and use. It conflates the interests of creators with the interests of investors. And perhaps most importantly, it distracts us from the questions that we should actually be asking, which are how well are current approaches to copyright actually achieving their aims? Copyright, when we boil right down to it, is about incentives and rewards. We award copyright to incentivize the initial creation of works and also to incentivize ongoing access to those works, right? But we don't do this, they're not aims in and of themselves. We do that in order to achieve the broader social benefits that come from widespread access to knowledge and culture. And then, so more properly, I think, they can be described as access aims. And then on top of that, we also award copyright to reward creators. And that's not to further any utilitarian aim, although it might have the happy side effect of enabling people to make more of the stuff that we like. We do it because it's right and just to do so. Rewarding creators is a recognition that they have moral claims that arise, however you want to see it, from their contributions of personality or labor, from their ongoing connection to their works. And authors' rewards claims have power. And that's why the rhetoric in favor of broader and longer rights and against exceptions almost invariably puts authors at the forefront. You rarely hear claims grounded in the rights of investors to maximize their profits. Authors' interests are put out front, often in service to investors' interests, because the validity of those claims make them valid and effective. But the fact that rewarding authors is fundamental to the function and legitimacy of a copyright system doesn't at all mean it should be mindlessly expanded. It means that we need to pay much more careful attention to how we allocate those incentives and those rewards. Because right now, they tend to get mixed together. We talk about what investors need and what creators deserve without separating those two things out. So think of the red liquid as the incentives component, the blue liquid as the rewards component. When we talk about it like that, they end up effectively merged. But we need to distinguish them because they are different. Because we don't really mind who gets copyright's incentives component. That can be shared between creators and investors. What we're interested in here is getting the works produced and available. But we do care who gets the rewards share, because that's justifiable only for creators themselves. That's not to say that cultural investors aren't valid and important. but just to say that investors' interests and authors' interests are different and they need to be satisfied in different ways. So we have to demerge, right? We have to conceptually separate out that red bit that can go to anyone from the blue bit that's justifiable only for creators themselves. And if you're only going to remember one thing from this talk, it should be the delicious bagels and this point that I made just now. So what I'm going to do in today's talk is spend a little bit of time talking about how well current approaches to copyright are achieving their aims, including with reference to new research that we've done looking at access in Canada. And then I'm going to put forward one alternative bargain. And in Canada right now, I think you've got a once-in-a-generation opportunity with your current review and the current talk about reversion rights and the upcoming term extension to think about how you want to do things differently. And so I want to point out some opportunities that exist there for designing a different kind of copyright bargain that would maintain incentives, but also generate new revenues for creators and investors and facilitating better access for everyone. Okay, so let's start with our first aim, which is to incentivize the creation of new works. Once you separate this out from copyright's rewards aims, it comes into focus as being purely economic in nature, yeah? And so we can figure out what we need to grant by way of exclusive rights in order to incentivize the initial production of works by listening to what the economists tell us about what's necessary. And they build models that take into account things like rates of cultural depreciation, like how quickly certain kinds of cultural artifacts lose value over time, and also the time value of money, which is the most important factor here. The time value of money simply recognizes that a dollar you receive today is worth more to you than a dollar that you'll receive tomorrow, and much, 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 much more than a dollar that you'll receive 100 years down the track. Now, intuitively, we all understand the time value of money, right? Imagine you're interviewing flatmates, you find two that seem great, they both offer the same amount of rent. One says that they'll pay monthly in advance, the other one says they'll start paying monthly 10 years after they move out. Right? We all know that one of those things is worth a lot more than the other. That's the time value of money at work. So, economists have found over and over and over again that 25 years is enough to incentivize even the largest investments. And that's really even just on the basis of the time value of money before we take into account factors like cultural depreciation. So that's really the outside amount that's justified purely on what's necessary to incentivize the initial creation of a work. Now, Australia, the US, Europe, they all offer Life plus 70. You at the moment Life plus 50, but apparently you're about to join our club. That far exceeds the 25 years. So that excess needs to be justified on other grounds. Now, other incentive aims are put forward to do so. And in particular, it's argued that cultural intermediaries won't invest in making works available ongoing unless they've got exclusive rights over them. And this is one of the big supporting arguments put forward that got that 20-year term extension in the US back in the 90s. So in other words, the argument is that works that are in the public domain will be less available and subject to less investment than works that are still under copyright. Now, if that were correct, it would justify longer terms, because remember, those access aims rely on us having access to that knowledge and culture. And if getting access means giving longer rights, then absolutely we should do it. However, the evidence doesn't support the claim. Every published study to have tested this hypothesis has actually found the opposite, that works under copyright are in fact less available and subject to less investment than works that are in the public domain. One of the most striking findings was by Paul Heald, and this is a very famous graph that's come up very often. He examined the availability of books on Amazon over time. He found that availability drops sharply soon after release, and then it spikes again as books enter the public domain. And one of the headline findings was that books that were originally published in the 1880s were actually more available than books that were originally published in the 1980s. Until recently, all of the studies to have tested this underuse hypothesis were done exclusively in the US. So that was really useful, but it didn't tell us about what was happening in other countries. And it also meant that they could only compare availability of similar works, not identical works, right? Because a book couldn't be both in copyright and not, the same book couldn't be both in copyright and not in copyright in the same country. So my team has just completed the first international study analysing availability by copyright status. And what we did was we compared availability of ebooks that were available via Overdrive for public libraries to license. Anyone here use Overdrive from their local library? Yay, isn't it wonderful? Yes, excellent. The rest of you should check that out. So Overdrive is basically the Amazon of library e-lending, with all that entails. They have over 3 million titles available for license, almost 300 million loans last year, which is massive, especially when you look at the world market for book sales. Now, because we were looking at availability across countries, we were able to compare the availability of identical works in jurisdictions where their copyright status was different. And so I just want to briefly set out some of our key results here, because I think it's going to be interesting to you as you move into this term extension exercise, and as we think about how copyright promotes ongoing availability. So what we did is we identified all 250 authors from the Oxford Companions to Literature for each of our jurisdictions who died between 1962 and 1967. And we ended up with a bunch of notables like Aldous Huxley, C.S. Lewis, Sylvia Plath, Ian Fleming, a whole bunch of others. All of their books were in the public domain here and in New Zealand, and they were all under copyright in Australia. And in the US, due to their WAC system of renewals for older books, they could be either in copyright or in the public domain. And for each of those titles, we figured out their status using registration records. So that gave us the ideal conditions for a natural experiment. Because if the underuse hypothesis was correct, then we should see titles available at higher rates where they were under copyright than where they were in the public domain. So what did we actually find? First of all, 59% of these authors had no books available for public libraries to license in any of those 4 jurisdictions, regardless of copyright status. And where they did have books available, it tended to be just the few most valuable titles. So I think T.S. Eliot had maybe 5 of his AD plus works from his lifetime available in any of those jurisdictions. But then where authors did have books available, they were much more available where they were in the public domain, so Canada and New Zealand, than where they were under copyright. And even much more available than where they had that mixed status, like the US. And these results are particularly important because what we're looking at here is what commercial publishers are investing in. Right? So Overdrive only works, in the part of Overdrive we looked at, they were only working with commercial publishers. These were only offerings from commercial publishers. So these are the investments that commercial publishers are choosing to make over these titles. We had previously carried out a related study on almost 100,000 books, also on Overdrive. And in that study, we had found that there was a huge crossover in the books that were available in Australia and New Zealand. They were almost the same. And then the US and Canada, almost the same as well. And that's important because it gave us a baseline similarity for the kind of crossover that we would expect to find between those 2 pairs of jurisdictions. So to the extent that greater or lesser similarities were found in our public domain sample, they were more likely to be attributable to the copyright status. So this is what we found. So what you're seeing with the blue lines there, that is the differences in the control sample. and then I'm going to show you what we found in the public domain sample. So control sample, first we're looking at Canada and the US. You can see very similar rates of books. Canada had 0.6% more books available to its libraries than the US did. And that's in our control sample. And then in our public domain sample, 15% more titles available to Canadian public libraries than your neighbours down south. In the control sample, now looking at New Zealand versus Australia, again, New Zealand had a smidgen more books originally. And then in the public domain sample, again, New Zealand outperformed, 5.6% more books. Then really interesting as well when we compare New Zealand to the United States. New Zealand had 10.5% fewer books in the large-scale sample, but then almost 12% more in the public domain sample. And that's really quite remarkable when you consider that New Zealand's book market is 1% the size of America's. So, although publishers could charge higher prices for the books that were under copyright, and boy were they, that's another thing that we analysed, they were charging much higher prices that far exceeded the amount that they would be paying in royalties. They were still investing less and providing worse access where books were under copyright than where they were in the public domain. So this adds to evidence that works' commercial lives can end much earlier than their cultural ones. And together with all of the other studies to have tested the underuse hypothesis and all of the other research into orphan works, for example, it tells us that just because someone controls the rights to something doesn't mean they'll actually exploit them. Now, what I'm saying here is that longer copyright terms can actually be counterproductive to our access aims. It can actually get in the way of works being available. Now, of course, there may be other rationales that justify us awarding longer terms anyway, but what I'm saying is that they can't be justified on the grounds that they'll translate into better access. Now, a couple of other incentives aims have also been made over time to justify longer terms. I've dealt with those in the written paper and don't really have time to go into them here, but they also don't stand up to scrutiny. So the upshot is that terms beyond about 25 years are not justifiable on any incentives rationale. So if copyright really was purely utilitarian in nature, then terms really shouldn't last longer than about 25 years. But as I started with, on top of our access aims, our incentive aims, we've also got these powerful rewards motivations. And they justify creators getting something more than the bare amount necessary to incentivize their investments. Problematically though, under current arrangements, a lot of that rewards share ends up in other people's pockets. Your standard form Hollywood contract doesn't limit itself to taking rights on the planet Earth, but throughout the universe at large. So even if a lucrative extraterrestrial market does emerge, it's still not going to be the artists that get rich. Because rational investors don't limit themselves to taking the minimum necessary to incentivize their investments. They take everything they can get. On this planet, I have looked at an incalculable number of creative contracts. I am constantly seeing examples where investors have taken the rights, often to the entire copyright, or often all of the economic rights for the entire term of copyright, and whenever they can get away with it, for any future term in the event that it gets extended during the term of the contract as well. And creators rarely have any genuine choice about that, thanks to the structural realities and competitive dynamics of creative labour markets, as have been extremely well documented in the field of cultural economics. So long copyright contracts are problematic on both incentives aims, access aims, and rewards aims. Because first, as we've just talked about, just because someone holds the rights to something doesn't mean that they'll actually exploit them. And in fact, they might actually get in the way of somebody else doing so. So they can interfere with our access aims. But they can also make it harder for creators to get paid. Because although authors' interests and investors' interests are regularly conflated, they don't always align. And the divergence between them tends to grow bigger the longer the contract endures. And I'm going to show you what I mean by that by telling you a bit more about that study we did of those 100,000 books. Books depreciate really quickly, right? Most of them dead and gone within a year, right? Almost all of them within 5 years. And we wanted to understand how that was affecting the terms on which publishers were licensing them to libraries. So we wrote an algorithm that estimated the original publication year for each of those 100,000 books. And then we analyzed how publishers were pricing and licensing the older books compared to the newest ones. And what we discovered is that older titles are licensed on very similar terms to the newest ones. And these are our results here. So the 3 different colored lines that you're seeing there are the 3 main kinds of licenses. OCOU is basically, so all 3 of these licenses allow books only to be lent to one person at a time, no simultaneous use. And then OCOU is basically a perpetual license that can keep happening for as long as there's access to the book. Loan limited licenses, HarperCollins is famous for this, 26 loans, and then the book is worn out and needs to be repurchased. And the pink ones are the ones that are of particular concern and very timely at the moment. You might have heard about this in the media, particularly in the last few weeks. We call these exploding licenses. They're licenses limited by time. And so they'll last 1 or 2 years. And then after that, the book is deleted from the library's collection, even if nobody ever borrowed it at all. So what we're seeing here is the books that are still under copyright, using that sort of around that time period as a proxy for the ones that are in copyright. And what we see is that they are being licensed at approximately pretty similar rates for the very oldest books and the very newest ones. So there's no big difference in how the oldest books are being licensed, including for those exploding licenses, those time-limited licenses. So even though we know these books have depreciated, they've got much, much, much less demand than the very newest ones, but they're still being made available on these exploding licenses at the same rates or even higher rates than the very newest ones. Now maybe this would be okay because maybe those books are also much cheaper, right? They've got exploding licenses, but a certain price point, that's okay. No. What we also found when we analysed the price is that those books are being priced, the oldest books are being priced on at the same sort of prices as the very newest ones as well. In fact, we were really quite perplexed when we were doing sort of standard statistical analyses around price. We're trying to figure out what was the relationship between price and other characteristics, and we couldn't really figure it out. The only thing that did come up was public domain books are much cheaper. So we built a machine learning model. We learnt a regression tree to sort of test the relationship between price and all of the other factors, and it just kept splitting over and over and over again on the name of the publisher first. And what that means, again, this is all in the full paper and I'll have them on the slide at the end. What this means is that the prices for books are essentially being set at the publisher's whim without any reference to their underlying value to libraries. All right, so what does all of that mean? Well, first of all, it's problematic for our access aims, right? Libraries are less able to include certain kinds of books in their collections. They're not able to license as many of those older, low-demand titles, especially on those time-limited licenses. And instead, they have to spend more of their dollars on those new release blockbuster titles that they know are going to have demand. And that's something that we've just empirically confirmed via a nationwide survey of public libraries in Australia. That's exactly what they told us. So these practices are problematic for our access aims But they're also problematic for the rewards aims. And here we can start to see how investors' interests and authors' interests start to diverge. So what is the publisher's interest here, right? They're acting rationally. We might think this doesn't make any sense, but they're acting rationally if you think about what their interest is. They want to maximize their share of libraries' collections budgets in as efficient a way as possible, given their own staffing and resource constraints. They're not interested in ensuring that any particular author maximizes her income. And they're not interested in ensuring any particular book continues to be read. But the author's interest is really different. She does want to make as much money as she can from her books, and she does have an interest in ensuring that they continue to be available and read. And so if she was to control her own rights for her older titles, she would likely license them and price them on very different terms to what her publisher is doing. So this shows us that after a certain point of time, investors' interests and authors' interests can really diverge. And a license or assignment can actually start to work against an author's interest. And long copyright grants are problematic for other reasons as well. They lead to a concentration of rights ownership, which is why we've got have we got 4 media companies left in the world? That makes it much harder for new distribution models to emerge, and leads to a general lack of competition, all of which also makes it harder for creators to get paid. So what I'm really saying here is that a big chunk of each copyright is justifiable really only on rewards grounds. But as matters now stand, those rewards are overwhelmingly being captured by investors instead. And then sometimes they're even being exercised in ways that actively work against the creator's interest. And so that's why when we hear pro-author rhetoric being used to argue for broader rights or to defeat proposed exceptions, we need to be much more critically challenging those claims. Because very often, any benefits to creators are really only discernible on the most threadbare theories of trickle-down economics. So if we're serious about supporting creators, we should stop allowing their interests to be co-opted for the disproportionate benefit of others. So to sum up, how well our current approach is working out for us? Well, we're paying way more than we need to incentivize initial production. We're doing so in a way that actually prevents ongoing investment and access in works. And it can't even be justified as being about rewarding creators because those rewards are disproportionately flowing into other people's pockets. Or else they're just going to waste. And that's a really important point as well, that waste speaks to the fact that the overwhelming majority of copyrighted works simply aren't valuable enough to their owners to be worth exploiting. Right? That gives us a classic collective action problem. Right? Individually, those works have too little value to do anything with, but collectively, the lost value to society is huge. I think the root cause of these problems is the fact that we award copyright as a lump sum, paid upfront, in exchange for all of the things we hope it will achieve, but without actually requiring them to be done. Right? You wouldn't buy a car at a price that factors in a century of ongoing maintenance, right? Especially if the dealer didn't actually have to do it, right? But that's essentially what we're doing with copyright. And so the key to solving that is to be much cleverer about the ownership of rights. And instead of paying up front, we need to be paying by installments instead. And what I think and what the Authors' Interest Project that I lead is about is that we can achieve that by doing more to return rights to authors. Now, More than half of the world's nations already have some kind of statutory reversion scheme. You've got one here, of course, your ancient law that gives rights automatically back to authors' heirs 25 years after they die. In the US, of course, they've got termination law that allows authors to terminate transfers after 35 years if they jump through enough hoops on the first Sunday of the month in the moonlight with 43 virgins standing around them. It's pretty complicated is what I'm trying to say. But those systems were not designed for the digital era, and they don't take advantage of the opportunities we have today for a different kind of copyright bargain. Now, your Parliament, tasked with the copyright review, helped along by the Heritage Committee, who also had something to say about that, seemed to understand the moral imperative for reversion, and they have proposed a new reversion law that would allow creators to terminate contracts after 25 years. That's, as proposed, I think it would certainly be better than current arrangements, because we know that after 25 years it maintains incentives for investors. It would direct a bit more of copyright's reward share to authors, and it would free up at least some works to the possibility of fresh investments. But the reversion scheme that's been suggested in the report seems like it could import a lot of the problems of the US model, right? Authors would need to give 5 years notice. They would only have a 5-year window for exercising it, and then it would be lost to them, and they would have to register their claim. But because it wouldn't be automatic, it's likely that just as with the US law, it would benefit really only the most lucrative works, the most valuable works. It wouldn't do anything to help us with that collective action problem. It wouldn't help us reclaim the lost value from all of those works that are worth too little to go hire a lawyer and navigate this process. And for the same reason, it wouldn't do much to help creators' bargaining power, right? Because it wouldn't apply to so many works, and the biggest investors would continue to effectively rule the creative industries, courtesy of those enormous back catalogues. So I don't think it goes far enough to fix what needs fixing. And I think we can go further. We can design a new copyright bargain that maintains those incentives and does a much better job of facilitating access and getting creators paid. So to get us thinking about how, I'm going to sketch out one possible vision. I will say this is not the bargain that I would propose if I was free of all constraints. It's one that operates within the hard limits that are mandated by our outdated and unamendable treaties, Berne and Trips. But it does take liberal advantage of the wriggle room they do leave us. So Berne and Trips require copyright to last for at least life plus 50, but they don't say anything about ownership of those rights. And while they prohibit formalities on the exercise and enjoyment of works, they also permit formalities on transfers of ownership. And crucially, nations don't have to comply with any part of those treaties for works published within their own borders, only for works that are published in other member states. So countries can take what I call Berne's front door out. Now, it's long been assumed that countries would never domestically depart from the treaties for their own authors, because definitionally that would mean treating them worse than foreign authors, and the optics of that are just terrible. But as we've seen, kind of reached the point where that assumption is turned on its head, right? We've seen that long copyright licenses can harm creators' interests, but simply automatically reverting everything to everybody would result in an unthinkable splintering of rights that would make our orphaning problem so much worse than it is now. So maybe the only way that we can make it work is with some kind of formality. So if we can only achieve a better outcome for creators by domestically departing from the treaties, that option is at least on the table. It's just a little bit of extra wriggle room we have when thinking about what kind of copyright bargain we want. Just some caveats before I sketch out this bargain. I wouldn't propose this for large collaborative works like movies or for works that are made in the course of employment. They both raise quite different issues. But for other cases, here's a model for you to chew on. We know that 25 years of exclusivity is enough to incentivize even the most expensive investments. So we could start by limiting transfers and exclusive licenses to a maximum of 25 years. And we could ask them to be registered so it's clear when they end, and also to facilitate relicensing once they expire. Then, once the transfer ends, rights revert back to creators. And those creators could use them any way they liked, including by licensing straight back to the exact same investor if they liked what that investor was doing, if they were still the best one for the job. Or they might license it to somebody else, maybe a different business model, maybe they would exploit the work themselves. If the parties wanted to engage in new investment, like maybe they wanted to sell film rights or make a film or anything like that that requires a pretty long time horizon, then there'd be nothing stopping the parties from mutually agreeing to end their current contract and entering into a new deal for 25 years. So there wouldn't be any adverse impact on incentives. So this kind of wholesale reversion would maintain incentives for initial production, but regularly free up rights to new investments and give authors the opportunity to take another bite at the cherry, to get a bigger share of the rewards. And since rights would revert wholesale, it would mean there's a real chance for new business models to emerge that are not captured by the legacy industries. But we can take it much further than that. Throughout this talk, I've been talking about these two problems, right? That there's not enough money to pay creators, and that there's too much money being left on the table via all of these rights to works that aren't really being exploited. Not enough money, too much money. Not enough money, too much money. It got me thinking, right? That framing is suggestive. And one of the problems can help solve the other. Victor Hugo had a similar idea back in, I think it was 1878, his idea of the domaine public payant. He wanted publishers to share revenues with authors' heirs. And funnily enough, he wasn't so interested in the heirs of the blood, like your actual descendants. He was interested in authors' heirs of the spirits. He wanted publishers to put revenues towards nourishing future generations of writers to allow them to get a start. So we could do something similar as part of a new copyright bargain, right? I've already talked about registering transfers for all authors. For local authors, we could take it further. We could ask local authors to register their ongoing interest in any work that they still had an ongoing interest in after about 25 years. That would give us a central registry of all of those works from which interested users could easily locate owners to negotiate access. And we could use that registration process to facilitate all kinds of new licensing opportunities that currently have too high transaction costs. So for example, if it's a book, right, when they go to register their continuing interest in the book, then they could get an option. Would you like to license this book into all Canadian public libraries in exchange for $1 per loan? Yes or no, right? And you could license it. So all kinds of opportunities. And then you could just rinse and repeat for as long as creators continue to have an interest in their works. After 25 years, you've got to click the button and say, yeah, I'm still interested. Minimal hurdle. But what about all of those local works that are not registered, right? Which would be most of them. That's all of the forgotten books and music and lyrics, maps, ephemera, photographs, computer programs. Just about everything that was locally made, is at least 25 years old, and doesn't appear in the registry. All the stuff that's the subject of our collective action problem. Well, I would propose that we would put all of those unregistered works under the management of a cultural steward. It would be absolutely crucial to get the governance right. But then there's heaps of uses those works could be put to. They could be bulk licensed to universities and schools and cultural spaces. They could be put into that digital public library or into an archive. They could be licensed to creators for remixing into new works, re-enlivening things like electronic music. And of course, if a creator at any point decided that they wanted to get their right back, right, maybe because a new market emerged from it through that access, then they could do so at any time. And we would just have to have appropriate arrangements in place for any derivative works that have been made in the meantime. So I'd be asking creators to agree to a new bargain, one that asks them to minimally indicate an ongoing interest in their works, in exchange for which they get full access. But why would they agree? Well, they would agree, I would hope, and I would propose, because all of the revenues from the licensing of those neglected works should be put directly into supporting creatorship in the way that Victor Hugo envisaged, through grants and fellowships and prizes. So we would generate new revenue to get creators paid by reclaiming that currently lost culture. So I know there's been a ton of ideas. Thank you so much for listening so attentively. What I really wanted to show here is that we can have a different kind of bargain that takes advantage of copyright's non-zero-sum nature, right? That we can change the scope of rights in a way that wins new revenue for creators and new access for all the rest of us. We don't have to put up with our current copyright bargain and all of the collateral damage that comes along with it. The individual elements of the new bargain that I've put forward for you to think about aren't radical. We register for everything. Did we register for this talk? No, not this talk. Okay, but everything else. We register for everything else. I'm constantly registering for everything. Authors already have time-based reversion rights, including in this country. But the opportunity that we have now is to combine these existing elements in a way that affects meaningful change, right? We have everything that we need for a new copyright bargain that does a much better job of achieving its aims. We just have to design it to do so. Thank you. And as promised, here is a list of all of the papers I drew from for this, and if anyone's interested, feel free to get in touch. I'm happy to talk further. And then I think we also have time for questions.